Hello, what is up? So, this is going to be about multi-frame gen, why I'm not keen for it, why I think it's all overhyped. To be fair, a lot of people don't like it, but it's another very good video here with hardware unboxed with Tim, and he always gives you all the details you need. So, I'm going to put that on and watch it and just run through it and tell you what I think.
Are
So,
getting. Speaking of that, the reason Nvidia has given for why multi-frame gen is not available on older GPUs is because the Blackwell architecture includes a new capability called hardware flip metering, which is required for smooth multi-frame gen output. I've got no idea whether that's true or what the experience would be like with multi-frame gen on a 40 series GPU without it, but hey, exclusive features are good for business.
well, it's probably a bit like the 3000 series because apparently they couldn't run FrameGen, but then you got literally got lossless scaling there, which enables frame generation and AMDs. So it's probably another lie from Jensen.
Multi-frame generation will be accessible through one of two methods. Some games will support it natively, and in those games you'll be able to choose between three frame generation modes: 2x, which is the original single frame generation experience, and the new 3x and 4x modes, which generate 2 and 3 additional frames respectively.
Well, for me, the reason I really don't give a toss about it is because you will find more artifacts with 3x, 4x, uh, on 2x, which is a normal standard frame generation. So that's what are in games already when it's a feature there to use. Uh, there are still some artifacts, but they're far less noticeable with a standard. But it's only going to get worse as you go up. So that's my problem with it, and that you will get more ghosting and all that. So for me, considering this fake frames anyway, it seems pretty pointless to me most of the time.
They are labeled this way to describe the FPS output increase. The 4x mode generates 3 frames, which quadruples the FPS output. I do not believe this is a performance increase, so I'm not describing the gain that way. The other way is through a DLSS override available in the Nvidia app. At launch, this is how the majority of those 75 games will support DLSS 4. The Nvidia app will swap the DLL for you, but yes, it's a whitelist system. You will not be able to use the override on games not on the list. To use the override, you just go to the graphics settings for a game in the Nvidia app and you choose the
Yeah, see, the trouble with all this is causing black screens. People having so many issues with it on the 5000 series. So again, it ain't. It's not a feature that I feel I need to use. I mean, for me, it's another thing is it's like motion blur, a more expensive version because it's not a free performance either. It will knock your FPS down, and I'm going to talk about that with lossless scaling because I will go into that and why Jensen he actually doesn't like this developer who's made the lossless scaling app because this developer is literally offering all this multi-frame generation that for people that want to use it for like £6 on Steam or whatever it's costing. I mean, it's under £10. So rather than upgrade to a 5000 series, you could just buy that and it's doing the same thing. And what I've actually found out is it does use machine learning. So if we go in here, uh, it will. I clipped a screenshot. So this is. I was wondering why is lossless scaling more taxing, and it's because it's using machine learning. So it's using machine learning. So I didn't know that. I thought for an app like that it wouldn't be using machine learning, but turns out it does. And this is why Jensen. I do remember watching a video a while back that Jensen is he's not happy with this developer because this developer actually released this before the 5000 series come out. All this frame generation, say 3x, 4x. Again, there's negatives about it that I don't like, so I'm not really sold on it. But if I did want to use it, I could use that, and so could others. So that's quite interesting. But we go back to this.
the amount of frame generation you want, such as the 3x or 4x modes. Then when you are in the game and enable frame generation, instead of that game using single frame gen, the 2x mode, it will now use the 3x or 4x mode instead, depending on what you selected. A bit more clunky than native game support because you can't easily change the mode in the game, but it works. Let's move now into the image quality analysis. Everything you're about to see is captured on the GeForce RTX 5090 at 4K, so I'd recommend watching this at YouTube's maximum resolution. With multi-frame generation simply being more frame gen, its visual strengths and weaknesses are basically the same as single frame generation. In conditions where frame gen works well to improve smoothness, multi-frame gen is even smoother. But also in conditions where frame gen creates artifacts, multi-frame gen is likely to create more artifacts. Let's start with the good stuff though. Frame generation works impressively well when either motion is smooth and predictable, or the scene itself is relatively simple. In this Hogwarts Legacy example, we're moving laterally, and the background scene, the sign, the textures on the building and ground, are all moving in a very predictable manner. Even when we compare multi-frame generation in the 4x mode, MFG 4x, to a natively rendered output at the same frame rate, there's little difference in these elements. Outside of the moving character, MFG does a great job of accurately interpolating these elements, and it creates native-like smoothness and image quality. In a lot of games, this type of basic movement is commonplace. Alan Wake 2, for example, is a fairly slow-paced game where you walk to explore the world. Here, walking in a straight line is no trouble at all for multi-frame generation, and when we compare the various modes when all are at a render rate of 30 FPS, you can see the smoothness benefits that multi-frame gen is providing. Due to the relatively minor differences between each frame though, there isn't a drastic difference between the single and multi-frame gen presentations, though MFG is better. There were even times when faster movement looked pretty good. Here in Cyberpunk 2077, driving is a surprisingly good environment for frame gen. The car stays in a consistent position, the environment moves in a predictable fashion, parts of the screen remain similar between frames. It's really only the occasional unpredictable element on screen that trips up MFG. In this sort of scene, the smoothness boosting capabilities of MFG are better demonstrated. Its ability to fill in gaps for large parts of the screen holds up well. Yes, there are some artifacts which I'll explore soon, but again, when motion is predictable, interpolation is a great solution. And because these sections of generated frames are generally very similar to the rendered frames, they do genuinely improve motion clarity on high refresh rate monitors, unlike other smoothing technologies such as motion blur, which does the complete opposite and just blurs the image on that nice high refresh rate monitor you bought. As 4x MFG is just more frame.
Yeah, see, I don't like blur. I really hate blur. And all this is doing is introducing sort of more motion blur. And Tim will get into that.
Generation, it provides more of a smoothness boost than 2x FG. Simple stuff, really.
Not to mention all the extra artifacts you will see, because they will be more visible at 3x and 4x. So for me, all this stuff that Nvidia are pushing, they're going to give you worse image quality because it's going to be more blurry. It's fake frames anyway. And the other thing is latency. So you will, no matter what way you look at it, you're going to get more input lag. So it will be less responsive the more generated frames you add compared to upscaling or native if you're getting a good enough FPS.
Camera movements while stationary is also a great example of MFG. Here in Star Wars Outlaws, there is little difference between the MFG 4x image and the native image when both are outputting 120 FPS. The extremely predictable and consistent camera movement is a goldmine for this type of interpolation tech, as we saw from simple in-game movements. The problem with the things frame generation does well is that in many of these situations you don't actually need frame gen. Relatively slow movement with only small differences between each frame doesn't benefit much from being smoothed with additional frames. There isn't enough motion to make a difference. Same with when you're already playing at a high frame rate, reducing the difference between each frame. High frame rates are already relatively smooth and enjoyable. Where frame generation is needed to provide a smoother experience is when there are large differences between each frame, making the presentation a bit choppy. Provided the large differences are consistent and simple, frame gen will work well to smooth out the presentation. If the differences are inconsistent and complex, well, this is when we get artifacts. As multi-frame generation is just more frame gen, whenever there are artifacts in a single frame generated image, there will typically be more artifacts in the multi-frame generated image. This is because with single frame gen, you are seeing potentially artifact-ridden generated frames 50% of the time, but with MFG 3X, you are seeing a generated frame 66% of the time, and with MFG 4X, you are seeing them 75% of the time.
Yeah.
The simple fact is the more time you spend looking at a generated frame, the more likely you are to see artifacts. At high enough frame rates, these...
See, that's what I can't get past. I mean, for me, it's just overkill and just pointless, I think, for me. I'd rather have more real frames. At least with upscaling, you're getting more response because it's reducing the resolution because you're upscaling from a lower resolution. And with DLSS4 and FSR4, you're getting better image quality for it. So I understand that, but I don't really. I mean, if I'd rather lower settings, to be honest, and get an higher FPS than use all this.
These artifacts were sometimes pretty well hidden with single frame gen because the image would rapidly flick between artifact-free rendered frames and artifact-in-generated frames. With multi-frame gen and the shrinking of the time each rendered frame is displayed, I tended to find artifacts more noticeable playing with MFG on either 3x or 4x modes, and that's despite the higher output frame rate. You've probably already spotted some of the artifacts in the previous examples. Character motion in third-person games is one of the more obvious examples, where there will be garbling and blur.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm big on how my character looks, I don't want all that gargling and all that crap around the air. You know what I mean? It's just, I mean, you will see little bits in normal frame generation, but they're a lot less noticeable on standard compared to 3x and 4x.
As your player's character's arms and legs move. When cars pass by in Cyberpunk 2077, this is also prone to artifacts, as are elements that pass directly under or near.
I mean, in my previous videos, I did notice it. The further I went up using Lossless Scaling, and that's using machine learning. So I went to 3x, 4x, and when I was panning the camera, I did notice a lot more ghosting around the character. So, but it does seem to be that that's working very similar to Nvidia's.
The car or character. In more favourable conditions, so not 30 to 120 FPS frame gen, some of these artifacts are less noticeable and just blend into the gameplay. At other times, a car or NPC may catch your eye in motion, you look at it, and it's just not being rendered correctly. This contributes to...
I mean, that looks terrible, that. I mean, look all that bloody, all them artifacts around the nicks there. So that's the first thing I'd see. Even if I did have a 5000 series GPU, I doubt I'd be using it, to be honest, if I'm seeing all this crap. And then I'd literally rather have enough FPS real frames and go through all this.
To a scratchy, sizzly, unstable presentation that is becoming unfortunately common in modern games. If you see that in games with frame generation enabled, it may not be the developer's fault, but the fault of generated frames. There are many pain points for single and multi-frame generation when scenes are complex, when motion is not as predictable, or when you're just zooming around the scene.
That's the other thing. So Nvidia are pushing all this technology on developers, but it doesn't mean it's going to work well.
Multi-frame gen was especially bad trying to correctly display this glowing light in Cyberpunk 2077, for example. Here, all four configurations are outputting the same frame rate, and this, among other examples I'll show, categorically disproves the notion that visually, an output frame rate with frame gen is equivalent visually to an output frame rate without frame gen. Even when comparing 2x to 4, didn't really...
So, he's pretty much showing it.
That's
So
one
I won't
good
watch
thing.
the full video.
Capital One.
really notice the issues.
You kind of getting the point. There is a bit about latency here.
Gen. This means the FPS output increases when multi-frame gen is used, but latency either stagnates or regresses relative to native rendering.
So this is what I don't like. You're gonna get less response, like latency. They can say, Nvidia Reflex helps with it, but the more generated frames. This is why I said about people that play shooters won't be using all this crap.
This is why frame generation is not a performance boosting technology, because performance is heavily linked to latency, and enabling frame generation actually makes latency worse. Across the games tested, I've benchmarked at 4K using DLSS quality with quality setting configurations that allow for an acceptable base frame rate, so the experience is something we'd actually recommend. I don't think there's any point benchmarking FrameGen with a base frame rate of, say, 30 FPS, because we'd never recommend anyone play like that, and all configurations have reflex enabled, because again, why would you disable that feature if you're interested in a fast, low latency experience? In Alan Wake 2, I recorded native non-frame generated performance of 96 FPS on average, leading to 32.
You do really need a high refresh monitor as well, over 200, because latency will get worse otherwise.
2 milliseconds of PC latency, as reported through Nvidia's latency measurement tool. When enabling 2x FrameGen, the frame rate improved to 165 FPS, but latency worsened to 39 milliseconds. This is because you do get a 72% increase in output frame rate, but the render rate of the game, tied to latency, actually decreases from 96 to 83 FPS. This 14% reduction to render rate led to a 22% increase in latency. Latency further worsens with multi-frame generation. The 3x mode delivered 232 FPS on average, but latency of 42 milliseconds, and the 4x mode delivered 287 FPS, but latency...
I just honestly don't see the point. I really don't. I might as well go back to console and get a worse input lag.
Of 45 milliseconds. This meant the 4x mode pumped out 198% more frames, but the render rate dropped 25% due to the overhead of running FrameGen, and thus latency was impacted. Also seen in this chart is the frame rate of all configurations outputting 120 FPS. This again disproves that a frame rate with frame generation enabled is equivalent to a frame rate with FrameGen disabled. The latency of 120 FPS using MFG 4X is over 4 times higher, meaning the game feels 4 times more sluggish, more in line with a 30 FPS experience. When Nvidia claims that an RTX 5070 is equivalent to an RTX 4090 because the multi-frame gen FPS output is the same, they're failing to mention that the latency is much worse in the configuration using more frame gen, which is deceptive and misleading.
Yeah.
The latency
impact
from multi-frame gen is generally pretty similar between games. In Star Wars Outlaws, I had the game running at 110 FPS natively. With FG2X, this improved to 180 FPS, then 254 FPS with MFG3X, and 317 FPS with awful when used at this sort of 30 FPS.
Some important stuff he says.
Games shouldn't change much between single frame and multi-frame generation. This is true in the sense that in some games, the majority of the latency increase occurs when going from native rendering to single frame generation. In Star Wars Outlaws, for example, there was a 6 millisecond penalty to enabling FrameGen, but it costs just an additional 2.5 milliseconds to enable 4x multi-frame gen. In Cyberpunk, it was a 6 millisecond penalty to enable FrameGen, then another 4 milliseconds to enable 4x multi-frame gen. In other games like Hogwarts Legacy, the scaling was more linear between each step, so it is a sort of game-by-game thing. But the reality is that even on an RTX 5090, there is overhead associated with generating more frames. Creating those extra frames is not free. The render rate decreases as you enable more frame gen.
Yeah, so this is why the base, so say you're getting 80 FPS, and this is what I was seeing with Lossless Scaling. These extra generated frames, there will be a performance cost on the GPU you're using. So depending on what your frame rate is, you will be losing FPS just by putting all this multi-frame gen crap on.
And latency is higher than with single frame generation. This is something you'll have,
and that's another thing I don't like, latency,
to factor into the base frame rate you are hitting before enabling frame gen. Essentially, this makes frame generation a much more expensive but much more effective version of motion blur, another effect that tends to cost FPS when you turn it on.
Yeah, so that's quite, motion blur, I usually try and turn it off, but that can actually cost some FPS. So that's another important thing. And as he said, all this multi-frame gen is going to give you more blur in the image.
And which has been used in the past to achieve a smooth presentation like FrameGen is providing now. Obviously a lot worse because motion blur just blurs everything. Overall, the simplest way to describe DLSS for multi-frame generation, and the way we've been describing it throughout this video, is that it's more frame generation. It creates a higher output frame rate and gives you more smoothness than single frame generation, but it's also prone to producing more artifacts, and there's a slightly higher latency cost. All of the strengths of single frame generation are amplified, and all of the weaknesses are also amplified. Does this make multi-frame generation better than single frame generation? I mean, sometimes. It really depends on whether you're on the good side of frame gen or the bad side. In the best conditions, multi-frame generation is smoother, clearer, and makes better use of your high refresh rate monitor. In the worst conditions, the flaws make it even less usable and more problematic than single frame generation. This can be on a game-by-game or even scene-by-scene basis, but at best I'd describe it as an inconsistent improvement. The problem with multi-frame generation is that it doesn't lower the bar to frame gen or change its requirements. The technology still works best at a relatively high base render frame rate, so that the differences between frames are small to minimize artifacts, and so that the latency of the game is still relatively good. It's not a situation where now you'd consider using frame gen at a base 30 FPS, where previously you'd only have considered it at 60 FPS. The quality of the experience is still heavily linked to the actual render rate of the game, even if the output frame rate is now higher. Ultimately, my recommendations for where it makes sense to use frame generation are unchanged. For the best experience, I would recommend a starting frame rate of 100 to 120 FPS for a smooth, clear, artifact-free, low latency gaming experience.
So it's pretty pointless for people with monitors of 160 hertz or 144 hertz. So I really don't see the point of it.
Enabling multi-frame generation will typically lower your render rate to around 85 to 100 FPS, but spit out 250 to 350 FPS. That's a really good experience because artifacts are not very noticeable at these sorts of frame rates, and the latency experience we typically associate with 85 to 100 FPS single-player gaming is pretty good. If you're less latency sensitive and don't care too much about the responsiveness of a high refresh rate, then the minimum I'd recommend for multi-frame generation is a starting frame rate of 70 to 80 FPS. Enabling MFG will lower your render rate to around 60 FPS and pump out 180 to 240.
So it literally this is why, because again I limited my knowledge by choice on all this multi-frame gen. Because I wasn't literally aware of the performance cost too much at all. I know AMD's, but so this explains why. Because AMD's, I don't think that's using machine learning. So this is not. I don't think it's using machine learning. So that explains why the performance cost is less on that. So I did notice on here that image quality was better when they're applying the frame gen. So that kind of makes sense now because there was less ghosting on the crosshair when I'm playing a shooter. The only game I've seen it where it was practically the same was that Doom Dark Ages, but I found on here it was a lot better. So that makes sense to me, you know. So there is a performance cost when you're putting this on. All this. So again, for me, what is the point of that really? If you're getting a good enough FPS, I mean, I'd probably just play at 80 FPS. It doesn't really bother me too much. The only time I've actually used the standard 2x frame generation, as they call it, is when I'm getting like, say 55 FPS and I want a bit more to get over 60, so I'll put it on to smooth out the motion. Probably like more 45 FPS in games like Cyberpunk, because on the 48 is the only way really to smooth it out in motion. But then I do remember seeing some artifacts and stuff like that, so it makes sense, and totally makes sense now.
The FPS, maxing out your very high refresh.
Because I really couldn't give a toss about all this stuff, so I didn't really look into it until now. But I've learned a lot just by watching Tim's video as well. So it's answered a few questions for me.
Rate monitor, while still delivering the responsiveness of 60 FPS gaming, which for many PC gamers is the minimum acceptable level. Anything below this, and the feel of the frame generated output becomes quite bad, very rubbery and slow and unpleasant, plus artifacts become significantly more noticeable.
Screwfix Sprint, super fast.
Anyway, I think that pretty much sums it up why I'm not really for it at all. again, it's not like I'm never gonna look at a multi-frame gen in a good light, 3x and 4x, and even if I had the 5000 series, I doubt I'd ever use it because there is too many artifacts. You get a lot of blur in motion. It's like it's a more expensive motion blur when you go in 3x, 4x. So the furthest I'd go with it would be the normal frame generation you do get in the games right now, if you want to smooth it out a bit. And artifacts will be a lot less noticeable, at least, but you'll definitely notice them more at 3x and especially 4x. So for me, I don't see the point in it. So when you're looking at this up, I want to talk a bit more about this because I did test it out a bit more the other night. So you have also got the scaling option. So this is like upscaling, but I wouldn't recommend it because I've found, like, unlike normal upscaling, you do not get an improvement in the FPS that I found, which is a bit pointless. And also these FSR, seems to be a very old version of FSR, and this one just looks completely bad. So looking at them, I mean, it adds a lot more blur. That seems to add a lot more fizzle. So it must be an old version of FSR. So for me, the main use of this would be the multi-frame gen if you want to use it. So there will be a performance cost, but it is using machine learning as we saw in here. So I didn't know that. So that explains why when I'm putting it on, the image quality at least looks better. So it looks, I mean, you will get more frames with this. It will knock your FPS down less using this 2.1, but it's not using machine learning. So I think the ghosting will be reduced from what I've seen of it anyway. And the image quality will generally look better because it's using machine learning, which I was quite surprised about. So yeah, I mean, rather than upgrade, you could use this, pay it. It's under £10 on Steam, Lossless Scaling. Sometimes it's on offer and you can get it like for £4 like I did. So you can do all that. Again, don't use that. Oh yeah, for AMD, you don't need to enable that. Just use it for Nvidia. So that's that. And yeah, I mean, he's definitely got the ump about this, Jensen, because it's pretty much doing the same thing as Nvidia's. So he wants all this multi-frame gen to be exclusive, even though for me it's not working great anyway. I mean, I think the negatives far outweigh the positives for multi-frame generation for me, and that's why I don't like it. Now, I mean, I'd much rather have real frames because that's more logical. I think logically in gaming in life usually, and I just don't see the point. It's like they're trying to sell you less powerful GPUs and then try and fob you off with this multi-frame gen. But as Tim said, a 5070 isn't anywhere close to a 4090 because the experience is a lot worse with latency and artifacts when you put all this crap on, all this multi-frame gen. So Jensen is being a complete tosser, disingenuous when he's saying the 5070 can be as good as a 4090 just because you're putting all this multi-frame gen on, and you've seen that video, you've seen all the issues with it. So I think that's what the video is about, really. If you don't understand multi-frame gen, I think this is a pretty good video on how it all works, and there is a performance cost. So these 5060 Ti's, you want to put it on, that's if you're not running out of VRAM, and then there will be say you put DLSS quality on, you're getting 60, you'll be losing it could even drop to 50 FPS or below before that multi-frame gen goes on. Then the latency will be worse. For me, I'm not for it at all. I mean, now I've looked into it even more, I've realised it's even worse than I thought. So that would be my advice on it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.